All right, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to Irving Arts Center's Lunch and Learn. My name is Marcy Inman. I'm Director of Exhibitions and Educational Programs here at the Irving Arts Center. Thank you so much for braving the rainy weather and the flooded streets and joining us today for what I'm sure will be a fascinating and informative program. Our guest speaker today is Rachel Black, an Irving-based artist and principal lecturer and lead faculty member of the Foundations program at University of North Texas. And she is here to discuss her recent body of work currently on exhibit at the Irving Arts Center titled Rachel Black, Journeywork. Journeywork, on display through June 28th in the Carpenter Lobby Gallery, features landscape paintings inspired and informed by her travels throughout the American West during her faculty development leave in the spring of 2024. The title of Black's exhibition, Journeywork, is taken from a quote from Leaves of Grass by the great 19th century American poet Walt Whitman. The quote is, "A blade of grass is the journey work of the stars." Like Whitman, Blake's work is a celebration of nature and the interconnectiveness of nature, as well as a contemplation on humanity's place within it, and an invitation to you, dear viewers, patrons, and art lovers, to contemplate this as well. We are recording today's presentation, and Ms. Black's talk will be available to view on the Irving Arts Center's YouTube channel in the next 2 to 3 weeks. As always, there is time allotted for Q&A and remarks, so please raise your hand to speak, and a microphone will be passed to you. The microphone is necessary so we can capture the audio of all your comments and questions on the recording. So without any further delay, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Rachel Black.
Thank you, Marcy. Thank you so much for coming out today. I really appreciate you being here. And I just want to talk a little bit about the paintings, but also I wanted to talk a little bit about composition and the way that I approach the blank canvas. So I invite you all to participate. I'll be asking some questions, and we can make this more of a discussion than a lecture. I hope you've had a chance to see the paintings. I was so fortunate to be given a sabbatical break by UNT last year in the spring. Such a gift to still be employed by the university but not be responsible for any teaching for that one semester. So it allowed me to do a lot of travel and focus on my painting that I'm not able to do in a normal semester when I'm teaching in class. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the way that I approach my work. And I want to start with this illustration, if I can figure out how to advance. And this is something I show my students. A lot of what I'm talking about today is the way that I approach art making with my students at UNT. And so we have this character, the artist, out in the landscape, and there is this sort of rectangular form floating in the space between his subject and himself. Any idea what that form is?
Canvas.
The canvas? Yeah. It's sort of the image and the way he's sort of framing it, yeah. So I like to call it the picture plane because it relates to how this small slice of being in the world, which is 360 degrees, plus the fourth dimension of time, what it feels like to find one small sort of slice of that is worthy of being a painting. And beyond that, the way that the the plane functions for me as an artist is a window. So it is representing the surface of the painting, but also sort of a window onto an illusionistic space that exists beyond the surface of the painting. So I'm interested in the picture plane as a window also. So this is one of my favorite artists. This is John Singer Sargent. You might be familiar with his work. Of course, he's known for opulent portraits, but some of his most exciting work, I find, is these landscape studies that he created. This one is a great example of the picture plane as window into illusionistic space, because we're meant to feel like we are in the mountains. And there's some devices that are at play here that maybe aren't clear upon first inspection that I want to talk about. I like to think of this as stacked space, almost like you are holding a hand of cards, right? And there's sort of a flatness because we're working with the flat surface of the canvas. And these things are sort of stacked, overlapping each other. So you can see very clearly that there is a foreground, which is delineated by this pile of rocks and a waterfall. And then the next stacked space is middle ground, and it's sort of represented by this stripe here. And then finally, the back sort of playing card is the background, and that is dominated by this majestic mountain in the distance. So this stacked space gives us defined sort of areas that contribute to that illusion of depth. So in the foreground area, you can see that there is more detail, higher contrast, more vibrancy of color, and that sort of progressively becomes muted in the middle ground. And then in the background, what we have happening is a sense of atmospheric perspective, where the colors are blued down. There's sort of a purple haze back there in front of the mountain, so that will push it back in space. So pretty much a classic sort of setup here of foreground, middle, and background. And then I want to point out before we move on, like, where are we in this space? We're just sitting by the side of the trail having a snack before we continue our hike. So it really immerses you, it makes you feel like you're right there, sitting next to the waterfall. Totally different take on the canvas as window by Wayne Thiebaud, another favorite artist of mine. Totally different sort of methodology here of thinking about the picture plane. Any idea what city Thiebaud is painting in this image?
Is it Los Angeles?
No, but close. Yeah, San Francisco, right? So you have that precipitous sort of hilly quality. This is taken like to the roller coaster level, so it's exaggerated, but he's taken that sort of key indicator of the identity of the city and made it sort of the subject of the piece. What I think is interesting about Thiebaud, especially in comparison with Sargent, is point of view. And that point of view is for the artist, but then now we're taking on that point of view as a viewer. So do you get that sense of sort of like being a bird in the sky? We're very much elevated. So we could either be like in a drone maybe on the top of a tall building. So most of the canvas is taken up with what is essentially the ground plane, sort of like the busy street. And you can see that the horizon line is pushed all the way up to the very tip top of the canvas. So a totally different sort of way of representing space. And something else I love about this is this sort of like curvy little line that tells us exactly where we're headed up this street. There are still aspects of stacked space in the Thiebaud. So you can get a sense of building in front of building in front of building. And those sorts of devices added together do develop a sense of illusionistic space beyond the picture plane, but just in a different way than Sargent. So, dear Grandma Moses, self-taught artist. So there's a quality of naivete in Grandma Moses's work because she's a folk artist. But what I find interesting is that there's a device similar to what we just saw in the T-bow, right? This idea of sort of the road that is going backwards in space is shown to be going vertical on the picture plane. I don't think that Grandma Moses, because she was self-taught, is as strategic about composition. Instead, I think that she has presented the scene to us as a stage set for the sort of drama that's unfolding in terms of the people that live here, the farming that they do. So really, it's about that sort of the drama of the farm and sort of telling that story. And that's why it comes across more like an illustration than like a view into an illusionistic reality, almost like you'd find in a storybook. But I still want to point out that we have a similarly aerial view, kind of like in the T-bow. So we're kind of like bird's eye looking down on the space. And I think that the key here is it's about the experiential quality of farm life and sort of the human activity, the animals that are involved in that. One of my students turned in this piece this semester, and I was so excited by it because I just thought it was so sophisticated for some of the reasons that I've been describing compositionally. So Abby does have the classic foreground, middle, background thing happening. It's pretty clear that this tree and sort of this garden edge is in the extreme foreground. It's sort of sharing space with us as a viewer. And the reason why is scale. It's so large. Also, it's cropped off the page, so it pulls that into the space that we inhabit. And then I see the middle ground is sort of being inhabited by this sort of courtyard space, which is defined by the wall. And then finally, the background being this foliage that exists sort of beyond the wall edge. What I think is really, I guess, beautiful about the way that Abby presented this landscape is the ghostly image of the chair. Do you see that? It's like it used to be on the left and now it's moved to the right. Just with that sort of very simple gesture, she has brought in the dimension of time. So something happened here, right? Somebody moved this chair. And I thought that brings the sense of narrative or suggestion of action that we have missed, and the possibility that that character might come back into the space. But I think there's also a quality of ambiguity in terms of the space, because Abby did such a good job of sort of holding back and not giving too much information. I also think that the way that she handled the foliage is so expressive. It kind of gives a feeling of the breeze rustling in the trees. So I was so pleased to see the way she was thinking really thoughtfully about landscape with this piece. So I just discovered this artist, Aisha Imdad. She has a show up right now in Austin at Women and Their Work Gallery. The reason I chose to share this one with you is because compositionally, it's certainly not a window, right, into an illusionistic space. It's something entirely different, even though it's a landscape. The first thing I thought when I saw this was garden planning, blueprint, right? The idea of laying out sort of the scope of your garden on graph paper, because the major central element here is the triangle of the pond, and we're seeing it directly from above, looking down. But the other elements of the composition we are not seeing from above. You know, if you've ever seen like an architectural rendering, those trees are usually shown as circles, right? Because you just see the canopy from above. Here we get to see the whole sort of side of the tree, and it's not naturalistically presented. It's sort of like embracing the edges of the pond. So I thought it was such an elegant and sort of unexpected, almost fairy tale way of representing this space. And it's not just about, of course, the way that this garden looks. It's about all of the important characters that share the space, the birds, the peacocks, the ducks, etc. So next, since we've done sort of a crash course on looking at how artists work with composition, I am bringing up this image from my show, which is an oak tree that I found on a hike in the LBJ grasslands, which is out near Decatur off of 287. So me and my husband spend a lot of time out there hiking. It's been a place that I've painted quite a few times now, and I wanted to invite any of you that are willing to talk about how you interpret this composition, if you'd like. If no one wants to jump, I can help, but...
I'll start.
Great.
Marcy says, oh God, here you go.
Thank you, Robert, for breaking the ice.
Well, we've done several tours with kids going through your exhibit, and one of the things we point out to them is that it's almost an extreme foreground element, and the idea that they would have to push their way through it to get into the painting. So it's not just a foreground, it's almost a barrier to get into the painting, and see that a lot in several of your paintings. Pretty short for me.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that. That's exactly true. And actually the reason why this is extreme foreground is because this branch basically whacked me in the head on my hike. And I thought, well, I can't ignore this. But what's interesting to me is the idea that the extreme foreground is not just a pile of rocks like in the Sargent, but it's something which is spatially close to you, which is not part of the ground plane. So something that's sort of sticking forward. So that's how this is functioning, where the foreground is sort of aerial, right? It's sort of floating in space. And that gives me room to call the basic ground plane of the painting, it becomes the middle ground. And then if you had to be pressed to find the background, it might be this like semi-abstracted area in the top left. And I deliberately chose to leave that loose so that it didn't compete spatially with the branch that's in the extreme foreground. So even though it's vibrant in color, it is loose in application, as opposed to sort of the degree of detail that's happening in some of these other areas. So I am using some of Sargent's devices there of trying to enhance contrast, level of detail, in order to show a separation between foreground and background. I'll also share an image here that's not in the show. It's a painting that I completed after the show was installed. And I don't know if anybody might like to break down this composition for the group. I'll give you some time to think about it. No takers? Connie?
You tell us. I'm not an artist, so I'm learning from you.
So I think you can find the 3 layers of space I've been talking about pretty easily here. So again, we have a foreground, right, which is about almost a half, maybe a little more than a third of the bottom of the painting, which is sort of the space that we inhabit as we're standing in the landscape. And then I think of the middle ground as being these 2 sort of vertical walls of rock, which sort of define this sort of canyon that we find ourselves in. Also in the middle ground is this branch that's sort of reaching up and framing, in some sense, the extreme background, which is that sort of yellow wall of the canyon on the other side. What I think the whole painting is here to support is this little tiny patch of blue sky. That's what we're really looking at. So all of the work I did to set up that, that special moment in the deep distance, even all of this detail work down here is in service to that little patch of blue sky. This is in Capitol Reef National Park on a little hike. I was really enchanted with the idea that the landscape that people maybe identify the park with, the expansiveness, the postcard image, is hidden by these walls, right? And I'm interested in the image that places you bodily in the space, as opposed to celebrating the picturesque. So that's what I'm trying to do in a lot of my work.
Rachel, I'm glad you used the word body, because the large rock formation in the lower left, it looks almost like flesh. It's got kind of a bloody, flesh-like chunk aspect to it, which kind of, I don't know. I mean, I see a connection to a body or to a presence. Mm-hmm. It's a little disconcerting, and it's not your typical experience when you go to look at vistas in a national park, but it's really interesting.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And not only does it look fleshy, but it has the teeth. I don't know if you picked up on that. It was a very odd, I think what happened is that there's various stages of sort of erosion. So these things start sort of emerging out of the rock, and some of the strangest colors and forms come out in those desert settings. Thank you. So that concludes our crash course on composition, and now I would like to move on to set up the activity that I have planned for us to make drawings this afternoon. So switching gears a little bit here and starting with Georgia O'Keeffe and talking about figure and ground. And it's the most basic sort of setup when you begin a drawing or a painting, is that you start with your format, which is the canvas or a piece of paper. And then anything you add, whether it's a mark or whether it's a beautiful drawing of a banana flower, as here, you're setting up a relationship between the blank paper and the positive shape of the subject matter. So here they're labeled 1 and 2. The problem is that many novice artists don't really think about the paper. They're too fixated on the subject. So the whole focus of what we're talking about today is to make us all think very deliberately and critically about the paper as the first shape of the drawing. In addition to thinking about figure and ground, I want to introduce the concept of composite. So this is clearly a group of people maybe standing waiting for the bus, but there's no delineation between individual figures, right? They become one positive shape on a white rectangle. So that's what we're calling composite. The other thing I want to point out about this image is that it relates to the silhouette. So if you're familiar with the idea of maybe even a cast shadow, the idea that the complexity of the form of this group of people has been simplified into one single shape on the page. So the idea of silhouette and using silhouette as image goes back to Victorian times and probably further. It was a device used for portraiture. It also makes me think of the cameo pen that my grandmother had. The idea of having that sort of profile head is definitely a silhouette, which is what we're going to be working with. My computer is about to restart. Don't want that to happen. I'm trying to tell it to ignore. We'll see.
Babies can be pesky.
Yes. Even though this feels old-fashioned, I want to point out that there is an amazing contemporary artist working with silhouette. This is Carol Walker. And so she's taken the silhouette from something that is precious, like the cameo pen, and blown it up to the wall, right? So some of her figures are life-size, and they're these amazing complex dioramas, and she's using composite shape. So I'm presenting this boy on a bike as an example number one of composite, because we've got two that's becoming one, right? We've got the boy and the bike, but also to talk a little bit more about figure and ground and how the format of the paper changes the way that we read the action of the drawing. So just the aspect of giving him some extra headroom changes the way that we read that composition, as opposed to it being closely cropped on the right, which has more of a sense of static quality. The other thing I want you to notice when we're talking about the boy on the bike is the importance of the negative. So negative shapes are anything that is not part of the black positive, right? So sure, it's format, as I've said, the rectangle, but it's also these little holes, right? And they are interesting. Some of them border on organic, and some of them are geometric, but those trapped areas of white can become as interesting and pivotal a part of the composition as the black form itself. So here's another couple of takes on composition with the same subject, right? So as soon as we add boy number 2, he's smaller. So immediately we're setting up a spatial relationship, right, between foreground and background, even though we're just working with silhouette, which is flat black on flat white. Depending on placement in terms of the format, we can suggest action, right? So the idea of him sort of coming off of a ramp and descending into the space that we've left for that action at the bottom. And I talk to my students about all of these things: scale, the negative, seeking variety, using repetition. Already we have repetition of 2 circles, but when we add a second figure, we've got 4 circles, and that sort of suggests movement across the picture plane, and then thinking about balance. The other thing that starts to happen when you make a more complex composite is you can start making your own trapped negative spaces in between forms. So that's something that I'd like you to try to do when we start drawing. So this is the way I start this activity with my students. And it's the idea of starting with the paper, which represents the format of the drawing, and playing with composition before I even pick up my pencil, right? So I have a collection of objects, and I'm sort of orchestrating, conducting, deciding how I want them to relate to each other on the page. So right away, what happens when I challenge my students with this is they're working at life size, because this is representing the drawing paper that they're going to be moving to. So the scale is sort of decided for them. which is much like this next image I wanted to share. This is a very distinctive process with a distinctive color, which is about silhouette at life size. Do you all know what this process is?
Blueprinting.
Yeah. It's actually called a cyanotype, but it is basically a blueprint image of what you are exposing to the sun, right? So it gives you a silhouette at life size. And the paper is photosensitive, right? So when you put it in the sun, it gives you this negative image where the item is. You could use leaves, of course you could use other things. But this project functions much like a cyanotype in that way. So I wanted to share some student work with you to talk a little bit about how these folks are using composition. I think that they all have different strengths, and they can be points of inspiration for how you might address the same challenge. This piece by Maria, I see repetition happening for sure of the circle form and that sort of loop-de-loop, almost like a slinky effect happening the way she's arranged this jewelry. There's also a repetition of teeth. If you can see that, it's almost like she's just raided her vanity to give us this arrangement. There's also a big space that hasn't been addressed. It's a big negative shape, which is pretty gutsy, right? I think that she gets away with it because do you see how this arrangement is sort of embracing the negative, almost like a big letter C? And so rather than this just being empty space, it's being activated by the way this is relating to it. So I thought it was a sophisticated response to the challenge. Let me show you some more. So we have the rhythm again, which happens when you have repeated shapes sort of stacked across the page. Repetition here, earring at the bottom, earring at the top. In terms of activating the negative, because we have, again, a great big blank spot. Any ideas or thoughts about how we're activating the empty space at the top in this one?
I would say the use of the cord or the string point in that direction.
Yeah, definitely. So we have this engagement, kind of like that meandering road in the T-bow, which is pointing us to the vanishing point. I agree with that. And because we have that quality of those chains sort of pointing up, I feel that there's a movement of descending, right, or falling that's happening here. So I always told my students, like, this makes me think of Alice in the rabbit hole, like things are falling. And it's a static image, right? But because of the way that she's managed, all that heaviness at the bottom reinforces that sense of movement.
But also to get across that empty space, you have to go from here, basically you have to go from here to here, which is, in a sense, that's an action in itself.
Yeah, the movement of the eye is, yeah, definitely a key part of it. So you are sort of navigating, and that movement is part of the dynamism, I agree. So Jasmine's not here. I still think this is a beautiful drawing, but I don't think it activates the negative as effectively as some of the other examples that we've looked at. Do you see how the arrangement is sort of self-contained? It's sort of coming in on itself, right? We do have some sort of appendages, right, sticking out, but mostly it feels contained, and I call that a vignette style composition where really the format is immaterial. The artist is sort of ignoring the rectangle and just working with this beautiful composite, which is highly complex, lots of trapped negative, lots of repetition, and hence rhythm that's happening. But I told my students, if I could chop off 3 inches, right? 2 inches on this side. If I could chop that off and actually make the composition better, it means like there's something being missed there in terms of how the positive relates to the negative. So what do you think of this solution?
It's almost strangely symmetrical between the positive and the negative.
I agree with you. So I call that approach yin-yang style composition, right? And I think Kelly was trying to get a rise out of me, but strangely enough, she succeeded in making a beautiful drawing. The other thing I want to point out is that she is engaging with the negative, just a little bit, right? Just a little bit with those branches, which totally take us all the way to that back corner, that top left corner. So pretty smart, pretty risky, pretty interesting. This is one of my overachievers, right? So I think that there is an acknowledgement, right, of the rectangle here. She wanted to sort of touch all 4 corners, right? But she's done some smart things too. Do you see this zigzag that takes us all the way across the composition, which I think is smart, just in the way that she arranged basic everyday objects?
And this one, you don't want to cut 3 inches off each side.
You couldn't.
It's filled the whole space.
She has. She's addressed every corner, every edge in some manner. So you couldn't crop it off. It's perfect as it is, or it works beautifully as it is. And some really nice use of lace as a very complex part of the composite. So anyway, here's just a couple more examples, and just to drive home the fact that there's thousands of solutions. So there's really no way to go wrong as long as you're keeping some of the things we've talked about in mind in terms of relating to the format. And also, of course, the other key rule is that everything has to touch in some way. So you can see my students got pretty clever in terms of bringing in very fine objects such as thread or jewelry, chains, so that they have a manner by which to connect. Here's another example of that, the shoelace. So they're looking for a variety of heavy, dark shapes, sort of contrasted with very delicate shapes to add interest to their pieces. And then all of these sort of terms at the bottom relate to the principles of design. So these are the vocab words that I'm always sort of driving home with them, thinking about some of the things we've already discussed: balance, emphasis, movement, proportion, rhythm, unity, and variety. So the reason I'm showing you this is because Octavio presented a departure from all the other examples I've shown you. I'm telling you, the students like to challenge me. Can you pick up on how this one's different from the other silhouette drawings, Connie?
The action or the objects are placed on the top instead of the bottom, so the foreground is kind of reversed.
Yes, true.
That one's not connected.
Can we please capture?
Yeah.
Say that one's not connected over here.
Yeah, so they broke a rule here. This is sort of like floating by itself on the side. There's something else in addition to foreground that you talked about. Are you picking up, Robert, what I'm talking about?
No. I don't think.
What about the space of this rectangle? It's a little bit different from the others, which we were looking down straight from above. Do you see the tabletop here?
It's almost what us architects would call a plan view.
Yes, exactly. So there is a suggested sort of plane in perspective, which is the tabletop that this is sitting on. And so you can tell that the toe is closer to us than the heel, as opposed to just looking straight down on his shoe. So he is giving us, or attempting to give us, spatial illusion in addition to the silhouette sort of solution to the problem, which is interesting, challenging and different, but exciting. And carrot I just threw in here because it was unique in terms of the visual weight of the positive, which is a little bit heavier, darker, more dominating than a lot of the student work that I had seen. So here's your challenge. And I don't know why this is so distorted. Please forgive me. This is my first step to the drawing I made to show you how you might approach the same problem we've been talking about, which is composite on a white rectangle. This is 9 by 12. So the first thing I did was arrange my objects, thinking about composition and all the things that we've discussed. The next step would be a pencil sketch. This is rather light, but I start with pencil. If you are not confident in your drawing, what you could do is lay out objects that you could trace, right? So there's no reason why you couldn't choose flatter forms and just trace around the edge to achieve silhouette. The next step would be to sort of reinforce and refine that silhouette edge with a fine Sharpie, and then to fill it in with a broader Sharpie. And then you want to make sure you give it some time to dry before you come in and erase your pencil lines. So this would be sort of a experiment in composition using the composite shape approach. So that's the last slide I have for you. But as Marcy said, I want to give some space for questions or comments, anything you'd like to add.
Are you a plein air painter, or do you work from photographs, or do you set up your easel out in the field and paint actually from nature, or do you? I use photographs myself because of my process, but I'm just curious as to where you are when you're painting doing the painting.
All of the paintings in the show were created in the studio from photographs. So
bring up that point, because then the camera lens becomes that box that you showed us at the very beginning of your presentation.
That's right, yeah. So when you probably are familiar with the idea of seeing a filmmaker doing this. Yes. It's the same idea, right? They're sort of finding where that composition lies in this sort of big expanse out here. And the camera does that work for us. But we still have to know where to point and shoot.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is, I'm not a very good photographer. Actually, I'm a very poor photographer. And I've thought about getting better at it. And then I thought, well, there's something in the struggle of taking a bad photo and making it into a great painting. And I'm not that interested in photography except for as a tool. I don't know if you feel the same.
Well, you can always start with the photograph, but make any changes that you need to do for the piece itself. Let the piece tell you what to do, in a sense.
Certainly, yeah, I agree with that. And then some of the paintings in the show are mashups, I would say. Like I took this plant from here and I put it with this background over here. So I agree, the photo is not the end. It's just the beginning of what the painting might be. Yeah. I do love plein air painting, but usually they're sketches and usually they're rather small and casual. But I do take my paints with me outside also. Yeah. Other questions? Well, thank you so much. Y'all want to make some drawings? We could certainly do that. I'm also willing to go take a walk in the gallery if you want to talk about composition or anything about the paintings that are on display. We could do that also.
I like to do that.
Great,
That's
okay.
my vote.
Yeah,
Maybe if we have some time after everyone makes their composition, but I
yeah.
would like to do that.
I think there's time
I'd
for,
like to go through the gallery and get your comments, because we have made comments to these, we've made comments to these kids that we've taken through and I would kind of like to know if we're right or if we made big mistakes talking about your stuff.
Yeah, I would too.
yeah.
It's always best to go to, pardon the expression, the horse's mouth. I'm not calling you a horse, but
No offense taken, that works. Well, Marcy, is that okay with you? I mean,
Absolutely, yeah.
certainly there's a big pile of junk over here that I brought from my house that you could use as subject matter is the idea, right? It's all laid out here and it's scaled appropriately to be represented at life size on the 9x12. So I can place this over here for reference if anybody would like to make a drawing. If you'd rather just visit about the paintings, that's fine with me too. So should we just go to the gallery, Marcy, and then anybody who'd like to can begin a drawing and whatever you guys want to do?
And I ask that because, when we take the students on tour, we're trying to interpret what you are trying to say. And so there's some uncertainty there on my
well, and we've got several months yet, and we'll be giving more tours of kids through the exhibit. And I personally would like to be able to pass on to them what your own personal thoughts and thought processes are, so we're not making things up and putting words in your mouth.
And they do interact a lot. There's a lot they get animated when we look at them and talk about them. So,
That's exciting. I'm surprised.
They do.
Good.
And the topics that it brings to mind, like environmentalism, nature, they can relate to that, and they really interact with it.
That's
And I'm
amazing.
an inexperienced docent, so that's what I'm seeing.
That's amazing that they picked up on that, because I'm actually taking a class in environmental philosophy right now, and I just applied for a artist in residency opportunity at Olympic National Park.
Wow.
So when I wrote my residency proposal, I'm bringing in all those ideas because what they want is interaction with park visitors. So you have to find a way with somebody that only might want to spend 10 minutes or less making something because they've already have an itinerary for the park, right? The idea of bringing those lessons about environmentalism, the art, all together in a 10-minute chunk is something I've been thinking about.
When is her show up till?
Through June 28th.
Through June, okay. I was hoping it was through July for the Teen Scene Week that we're doing on landscape painting, but
Are you teaching that class?
yeah.
Let me know if you need an assistant. I'll join
Well,
you.
it's called Deep in the Art of Texas Lone Star Landscapes. So we're going to be featuring the landscapes specifically of Texas because they're so varied around the state.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And I wish you were here to give them your insights into how you look at landscape and think about it. But maybe we'll have our YouTube presentation up by then and can show it to the teens.
She'll pop in one day.
Well,
Yeah, I'd be glad to do
Do
that.
you require a written invitation?
No. I'll just pop in. Great.
10 to 12, Monday to Friday.
How long is that class?
It's a 2-hour morning session, 5 days a week. It starts like July 10th or something like that.
How many weeks?
I'm sorry?
How many weeks are you teaching?
1 week, so it's
Oh,
pretty
okay.
quick. But
Okay.
I've done this before with the teens, and I'll go in thinking they'll do one thing, and then, like you're saying, they surprise you. What the heck are you doing, kiddo?
I know.
It's great, but what the heck are you doing?
I know. It's a challenging part of teaching for sure, but it's good. It's good for them to push back. Yeah. Well, I should probably say anybody who doesn't want to walk the gallery, of course, I would graciously allow you to step out, but we're going to head in there, I guess.